Happy New Year. I hope your 2020 is starting off with a bang. Thank you for listening to Author Stories through 2019 and all of the previous years. We had an amazing year last year and looking forward to doing bigger and better things this year. Before we get into the interview, we're going to thank a couple of sponsors who make the show possible. Please give them a shout out and look them up on Amazon and make sure that you tell them that you appreciate their sponsorship of Author Stories. At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. You're going to love this series. I love it so much. And Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it, and be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox. We're so happy to have our friend Crystal Pico Watanabe as a sponsor of the show. Crystal is one of the best editors in the business, and she has just debuted a new service that I think you'll absolutely love and will help you to up your writing game. Pico's School of Wordcraft and Editing has just debuted, and the first course is called Properly Punctuating Dialogue. It's a mini course and can be completed in just about 20 minutes. It covers the basics of dialogue punctuation. Authors can get access to the new school and the course for free by signing up for Crystal's author newsletter, Notes from Pico. Go to picoshouse.com/newsletters. That's picoshouse.com/newsletters. More in-depth courses will be added in 2020. Make sure you don't miss a thing. picoshouse.com/newsletters. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2 are only 99 cents for a limited time. The gods are rightfully imprisoned, and Cess intends to keep them that way. But her terrorist father has other plans. Gregory D. Little's Unwilling Souls is a pulse-pounding chase through an epic fantasy world of adventure, sinister conspiracy, and a magical industrial revolution fueled by harvested human souls. Cess is the daughter of powerful parents who would very much like to kill one another and who therefore pretend she doesn't exist. An apprentice jailer of the gods, Cess spends her days learning to forge the tools needed to maintain the gods' prison. When her terrorist father attacks the prison on her 16th birthday, Cess is forced to flee after the secret of her parentage is revealed. Suddenly on the wrong side of the law, Cess realizes the very father who abandoned her may be the only one who can protect her. But some secrets are darker than parentage. On her way to find her father, Cess will uncover truths about her family and herself that will shatter her understanding of the world and risk the return of the gods themselves. Unwilling Souls and its sequel, Ungrateful God, are on sale now for only 99 cents. The third book of the series is coming early next year, so now is the perfect time to get up to speed. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2, only 99 cents for a limited time. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories, Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Julie does not love being the center of attention. She makes dresses for those who do. But when Emily, her matchmaking friend, begs for a favor, Julie can't say no. It was supposed to be just one date. She never expected to kiss the guy, then fall head over heels for him. When threats start rolling in, it becomes clear someone will do whatever it takes to break them apart. Now she's in too deep, and walking away isn't an option. But with the paparazzi and drama involved, Julie cannot help but wonder, who wants to love a billionaire? Hollywood producer Harry Jackson is not an alpha male. He's goofy, sensitive, and will move mountains to make everyone happy. In fact, he requires a whole team of people to keep him from being robbed blind. Sometimes he even needs saving from his love of bad puns. But when an enemy threatens to jeopardize his chance at love, it's time to step up and fight. He's terrified, but the thought of losing Julie scares him more. Pick up Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? The Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Peter Robinson on the show with me today. If you are a fan of crime fiction, of thrillers and suspense novels, then I'm sure you have 1 or 2 or 10 or 12 Peter Robinson books on your shelf. I know I do. The Inspector Banks novels have been something that I've gone back to over and over again throughout the years, and I'm super excited to have you on the show today, Peter. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, it goes back to my childhood. I used to love being read to at night. The first book I remember was Black Beauty. My mother would read to me at bedtime. And, that seemed to create in me a desire to write my own stories. So as soon as I could write, really, school age, I started filling notebooks with my own versions of well-known stories like Robin Hood, William Tell, and I even illustrated them. All lost now, of course, but that's really where I began.
You were born in Yorkshire, right? Were you raised there?
Yes. Yeah, I grew up in Leeds, which is a sort of large industrial town in the north of England.
Do you feel like the place that informed your childhood, do you think that informs your writing? I love when, to understand how the places we're from go on to interject things into our lives. Do you feel that pull of Yorkshire and Leeds in the things that you do?
Yeah, I think it always exerts that influence. I remember being impressed by something Graham Greene said when I read it a few years ago, that the first 20 years of a writer's experience are really, it's all you have to work with. The rest is just invention. And, my first 26 years were spent in Leeds almost entirely.
Wow. You went to Canada to work on your advanced degree. Did you know from, and I know you told us about that love of story when you were younger, but did you know this was going to be a career path that you were going to pursue?
No, I wasn't so arrogant that I would assume I could have a career in writing, especially as at that time I was only writing poetry. And there really weren't a lot of creative writing courses in England at that time. And I saw one advertised in the department at Leeds for the University of Windsor, Ontario, a Master of Arts course in English and Creative Writing taught by Joyce Carol Oates. So I applied and went through various stages, and eventually I got to go to Windsor.
The new book that you have out, Many Rivers to Cross, is the 26th book in the Inspector Banks series. Is that right?
So they tell me.
My goodness. My goodness. When you're pursuing your Master of Arts in English literature, I love to hear from people who pursue these advanced degrees in writing, and then there are a number of writers who have no degrees at all and just kind of come into it. How do you feel like that education and that program in particular equipped you to do what you do today?
Well, it gives you kind of permission, the sense that being a writer is important. You're actually taken seriously in an academic setting, of course. But at first, I sent some samples of my work and they were rejected. But I was allowed into the English program, not the creative writing program. And after I'd been in Windsor for a month or so, I did a poetry reading one evening, and Joyce came up to me afterwards and said, "Why aren't you in creative writing?" I said, "Well, you rejected me." And she said, "Well, you didn't send what you've just been reading tonight." And I said, "No, I've written that since I've been here." And she said, "Come and see me tomorrow." So I did.
Wow. How does poetry morph into writing prose for you?
Well, it's not as strange as it seems. I mean, I was interested in poetry of place, poetry that gave a strong sense of place. I was interested in structure and poetry, starting getting into various sort of poetic forms and rhyme even. Crime novels have a solid structure.
Sure.
My crime novels, at least, I think, have a strong sense of place. And I just got hooked on reading them. I mean, really, what makes you want to do anything except you love it so much yourself? You want to try and do it.
Sure. In 1987, your first Inspector Banks book came out. Obviously, you're working on it for a while before that. Can you lead us into where Inspector Banks came from and why this character was so endearing to you?
Well, I tried my hand at a few crime novels before that, using private eyes or amateur detectives, and because I really knew nothing about police, and they just didn't work out. They fell flat. So I really enjoyed reading at that time books by writers like Reginald Hill, Dorothy Simpson, Colin Dexter, where you had a particular part of the country and a detective chief inspector and his sidekick looking at that part of the world through its crime, usually through its murders. And I was reading a lot of those kind of books, including European ones like Maigret and the Swedish couple Max Schowell and Per Valu. And I thought maybe that's the direction I should go. And, even though I knew nothing about police, in fact, I stole most of that from Ruth Rendell, who later said that she made it up. So I'm kind of twice removed from police procedure in those early books. That came later. But it seemed to work. I felt comfortable with Banks and Yorkshire.
Your prose is, to maybe borrow an overworn description that a lot of people use today, but your prose is very lyrical, and I definitely see that early poetry influence on your writing. I think knowing that now, looking at your work, you can see that metamorphosis in the things that you do. You also must be a lover of music because you reference songs in your books all of the time, and songs can be poetry set to music. And I've always been fascinated with songwriters and poets who can convey such emotion and take us on such a journey in such a small space. Where a novelist may take 100,000 words to take us on a journey. A song in 3.5 minutes can evoke a lot of those same things. What is it about your love of music that works its way into your writing?
Well, I did write a few songs, and I did have an involvement with a few bands when I was growing up. I mean, like any kid who grew up in the 60s, I wanted to be a rock and roll star, but I just wasn't good enough. So that kind of went by the wayside. But I used to hang around with a group of folk singers, blues singers, poets, and we'd go and do ensemble shows all over the north of England. So I got to spend a lot of time in the music world. I worked briefly as a roadie for a folk band. And most of my interest in music is simply from listening to it, and rock first, and then, pop really, and then rock. And then I moved into an interest in jazz and more recently classical. But I still mix it up. I still like all of them. And that's why I wanted Banks to be the kind of character who didn't just have one particular thing that he liked, but that he had very broad tastes in music.
Do you, when you think of a story, are there certain songs or pieces of music that tend to inform the mood while you're writing?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I don't listen to a lot of music when I'm writing. First of all, I can't listen to anything with lyrics. It distracts me too much. And even if I listen to jazz or string quartets, I find that if I'm really working well, I don't even hear them. They're gone, and there's a silence, but there might as well always have been silence. So I don't usually do that. But for the moods of the stories, I sometimes try and fit a song or a piece of music to that's evocative of what's going on, or in contrast to it. And of course, it starts with the titles, and like Many Rivers to Cross, a lovely Jimmy Cliff song, I think, says a lot about some of the characters in this book and the journeys they've made spiritually and physically.
Right, right. What's interesting about crime novels is they really do, and you mentioned this a minute ago, they really give us a window into what's happening in a community, with the people in the community, what our general fears are, and how those fears play out in real life, or in a fictional story that feels like real life. Starting back in the 80s writing these and coming up now to this 26th effort, how do you feel like the art of crime fiction writing has evolved over that time? And can you look back at your books and see a progression from what was going on in the 80s to where we are in the world now?
Well, I think in the 80s when I started out, my books were much more limited. They were a bit more parochial, set in little villages and various areas of Yorkshire that I was exploring at the time. As time's gone on, they've opened to embrace a wider world. And now, of course, things that happen in Russia or Sweden may well have an effect on things happening in Yorkshire. So I see more international connections. And as far as the whole genre has changed, I mean, when I started, there were no cell phones. There were hardly any computers. DNA analysis was in its infancy. You didn't have CCTV cameras everywhere tracking everyone's movements. It was a very different world. But these days, you've got all that stuff. And even if you don't use it in your story, you can't forget that it's there, because someone's going to say, how could he kill someone and walked out of that car park without being on the cameras? And if you don't cover that, you look like an idiot. But then you didn't have to worry about it.
You said that when you began, you didn't really know anything about police procedure and how all of that world works. With more than with all of the books that you've written, how has your process of discovering what is new, what is current, and thinking about how that police procedure world works, how has that evolved for you in your writing, and what do you do to stay up to speed on advancing technologies?
Well, there are various manuals, of course, but I have discovered over the years that when you're working in a field, you do tend to get to meet experts, and that experts are quite happy, to give you advice and to tell you how things work, as long as they're not talking about current cases or real things that are happening. They want you to get it right. So I started asking people, and I think I went through a phase when I was probably getting a lot heavier on the procedural stuff. And I thought, that's not really the way to go, because what people are interested in is the human aspects. Okay, yes, a little bit of forensics, a little bit of detection technique, but really it's people and drama that they're interested in. So now, I don't chase it down quite so much, and I just, hang out with my police friends whenever I can, because I enjoy it.
Right. From those early parochial stories, to use the word that you described, to these new stories that are very much global in scope and global in their implications, do you feel like that is an outgrowth of our society now, that because of the internet, because of cell phones and all of these things that keep us connected to the outside world, do you think that we as citizens and as readers are more globally aware than we were back then?
Yeah, I think technology has a lot to do with it. Also, when one of the major crimes behind Many Rivers to Cross is trafficking, especially sex trafficking. That's something that takes things across borders, takes crime across borders. It may start in Moldova or Croatia and end up in Italy or England. So it's the borders don't matter to the criminals anymore, and the organizations are coming stronger. The organizations behind drugs, behind sex trafficking, they're growing. They're getting more power. They're becoming more organized. So it can't help but be much more global.
You have never shied away from difficult topics, And this book is of course an example of that. We're talking about sex trafficking, like you talked about. We're also touching on some real hot button issues in this book. How do you begin to identify maybe the things that are important to people at the time that you know will resonate with readers in a story? Like how do you identify the topic or maybe the type of crime that is that we're seeing more and more to know that this is going to be a thing that resonates?
I think in the first place, I keep my eyes open for very little newspaper pieces that don't explain that much, that intrigue me, and try and find out more about them. In this book, for example, it's something called County Lines, which is now huge in the UK. I mean, there isn't a day goes by without the news or the papers have got some big story about it. But at the time I wrote the book, it wasn't that widely known. I mean, I don't know. You probably have similar things in the US, but basically it's city drug dealers ship their products out to surrounding villages and small towns, often using kids as young as 13 or 14. And the county line is actually a phone number, a mobile phone number that anyone can use to order the drugs. So as soon as the shipment's ready, kid goes off and they sequester a house, often belonging to somebody vulnerable, a drug addict or someone, where the dealing is done from for a couple of days in the village or the small town. Then the kid goes back to the city again. There are more calls, makes another trip. And apparently they use the young kids because they're less likely to come under suspicion from the police. So it's a terrible business, and of course a lot of the talk is about young kids being groomed and how vulnerable they are to this kind of life.
When you're dealing with a character like Banks over several decades, how do you keep growing him as a character without just becoming a caricature of himself? How do you leave room for personal growth in him so that we as readers need to know what happens next with him?
Well, he's growing older and a bit more miserable every day, it seems. Yeah, I mean, I try to age him in more or less normal time. And there's always a little bit of holdback because, the books may come out a year apart, but the crimes don't necessarily take place a year apart. So there's fictional time and real time. But he's in his 60s and, obviously has to retire soon. But, he's been through it all. He's brought up kids. They've left home. Now, one's a rock star. The other's about to get married. He's divorced, he's had affairs, he's had romances. All these things I think people are interested in. It's the sort of life that, well, not that all of us lead. We don't all get divorced and have affairs and things, but, it's something that interests people. It's a human element. It's the emotional element. And Banks is someone who has a very interesting job and a job that does affect him, but it hasn't made him cynical. It hasn't made him give up his faith in human nature. He still tries to see the best in people.
It would be a silly question to ask if you knew from the beginning that this character and this continuing story of his would be so popular and to lead to more than 25 books. But at what point did you realize, that this character had legs and that you were going to be married to him for the long term, for better or worse?
Well, it was probably a faster journey for me than it was for the rest of the world because, for the first 10 or more books, I was not very well known. Certainly not in the UK and Europe, maybe a little bit more in Canada and the US. But, I was comfortable with the character, so I kept writing. And there were periods in the 90s, especially when I'd be dumped by publishers and picked up by another who published a small number of books. I just kept my head above water. And it wasn't till about 2001 and 2 that I came out with a book called In a Dry Season that made a breakthrough of kinds. And after that point, things started to speed up a bit. People started to hear of me. Then there was a TV series, of course. So, it seems very quick for a lot of people who don't know about the earlier days. But that's how it happened. I mean, for a long time, I was sort of working there in obscurity.
There are some leading characters in a series where we never truly get to know the character. I'm thinking an example would be maybe a Jack Reacher, who's kind of always an enigma. You never really know what's behind all of that. You don't have a problem with Alan Banks of letting us into kind of his deeper, darker self, if you will. And there's one point in the book where he's talking about the black dog of depression, and feels like Sisyphus, pushing that rock up the hill only to have it roll back down again. Is there ever any hesitation to let us into his deeper self, or is that something that makes this character so relatable to us?
I think it's what makes him very relatable to people. I don't have any doubts about it. I mean, I love Jack Reacher, but you wouldn't want that amount of self-awareness or reflection from him. He's got to keep going. Self-doubt, should not exist in his world. But Banks, yeah, he's a more ordinary person. I mean, Reach is an exceptional hero character, but Banks is an ordinary guy put in a position where he sometimes has to do almost heroic things. And he's also introspective. He's become more philosophical, more introspective as the years have gone on. And that's one of the things I think that's developed with him over the years. If you go back to the early books, he's not quite as down as he is now. He was quite lively in the first one.
Well, and that sort of self-awareness is what keeps him from becoming a superhero. Someone that has no foil, that's kind of I'm reaching for a word that I can't find, but that's just unapproachable. He's very approachable, and we love it when a story wraps up, well, and the bad guys get what's due to them, and justice is served, but it doesn't always work out that way. And I think that's one thing that I appreciate about your stories is that we really get a real look into the real world. What's your planning process like for a story? Do you find a headline that triggers something in you and then you want to explore that? How do you decide how that case is going to unfold from the beginning?
Well, usually it begins with a place, oddly enough. I mean, I do a lot of walking when I'm over in Yorkshire. I have a friend who knows a few obscure pathways, and you come upon the strangest places, either an area, a ruined building, and it just grips my imagination. Then I have to kind of make up the story of what might have happened there. Now, that may come from contemporary events or something else that's been on my mind. You put the two together, and then, being a crime novel, there's usually a dead body. And what Banks does is, it helps.
Yeah.
He comes and starts asking questions about why this body got here, how it died. I mean, who was this person that brought on, what was it about him or her that brought on such a violent end? And from there it moves outwards to friends, family, work and various other aspects of the dead person's life. So maybe the most important character in a crime novel is the victim, because the story is all about how that person became a victim. So I don't actually plan it out. I mean, I just, work my way through in the dark like that until I see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, and then I head for it.
With so many books in the series now, and new readers are discovering your work all of the time, should they go back to the beginning and read from the beginning, or are there certain entry points that you recommend for people that are new to the series? How would you like new people to get into your work?
In some ways, it doesn't matter. I mean, of course, if you're the kind of person who has to start from the beginning, no matter what I say, you have to start from the beginning. And, there are a lot of people who will do that. They have to, and it helps in some ways because there is a gradual progression in, Banks' aging and what happens in his life. But you can start anywhere. And I hope I got better as a writer, the more practice I had. And I mentioned in a dry season, which was in some ways a breakthrough in the US and in the UK. And often if people ask me where they should start, I say, start with that one. Then if you like that, you can go back to the earlier ones. You can also start with Many Rivers to Cross, because even though it's the second volume of a proposed trilogy, it still stands alone. You don't have to have read the first one to enjoy it.
The new book is called Many Rivers to Cross, as you just mentioned. What does that title allude to?
Well, it's that song, the Jimmy Cliff song. And also, as I said, the journey of the characters, that they've come across many real rivers and they've crossed many difficulties. Zelda, I'm thinking in particular, also the victim in the crime in the book. So it just sort of ties things together thematically for me. I like that when I'm writing to have a title that, if ever I find myself straying, I sort of think of, and it brings me back again to where I should be going.
Speaking of Zelda, you introduced her in the previous book, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
When you've got a character like Inspector Banks that has had such a journey over 26 books, one of the most important things, and one thing that I really appreciate yours, is that you have this great cast of characters that go along with Inspector Banks. What does Zelda do, and how does introducing these new characters breathe new life into the story?
Well, Zelda's a kind of an enigma for Banks. I mean, she's, for example, living with a friend of his, but he's also very attracted to her and loyal to his friend. So there's a tension there. There's something between them, but we don't quite know what it is. He's also not certain that she's on the straight and narrow, which we readers soon find out that she isn't. So we know more about Zelda than Banks does. And one of the interesting things is the bits that he finds out and how he finds out and what he puts together. And that's what I think keeps it interesting to me. What he'll do in the end, I'm still not sure yet, because I haven't got there.
I love it. Well, the new book is available everywhere. Many Rivers to Cross. Peter, because we know how the publishing industry works, are you well at work on the next volume that might we see it next year?
I hope so. Yes, I am. And it's going to be called Not Dark Yet, which is from a Bob Dylan song title. And yeah, I'm well into it, and I'm hoping I'll get it done on schedule.
Love it. I love it. Peter, if people are just discovering you and your work and want to dig into all of the great stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
I have a website, inspectorbanks.com. So yeah, so they can go there. I try and keep it up to date, but I'm not the most social media savvy guy around.
Well, that's all right. We're going to put links to the website in there, as well as to the new book, Many Rivers to Cross. If you're looking for a crime novel, ongoing story that you can dig deep into, Inspector Banks is the way to go. We're going to put links to all of it in the show notes. Peter, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
No, thank you very much.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right. Doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. How do you know about that? He asked. You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen, the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. Come. Now. Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I? He asked the mysterious caller. You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire? The caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. If you're so close, why can't I see you? He asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.